Hello and welcome to the Aviation Briefing with me, Madison James. In this podcast series, I speak to media and industry guests about the biggest stories in aviation today. Now, I'm excited to be relaunching this series after a bit of a hiatus with our first guest, Chris Russo, who is Associate Director of Energy and Commodities Industry at Publicis Sapient. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Madison, for having me. And to be the inaugural guest here on the revamp and the relaunch is a real pleasure and a treat. So thank you very much.
No problem. We're excited to have you. So Chris will be talking to me today, basically all about the US-Iran peace process, the cautious reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and what this means basically for the aviation sector in general and those rising oil prices. So before we get into the topic of discussion today, Chris, I just wanted to ask you about your own journey into the aviation industry and your own interest in it, because I know you worked for a while as a broadcaster at WWE.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask you about that experience and kind of how your journey led you here.
Yeah, certainly a hard left and pivot from my first job right out of grad school and master's to be a broadcaster for the largest professional wrestling organization in the world. But, as it goes with entertainment, flavor of the month, 1 month, flavor, not the flavor of the month, another month. So it was that, trying to find sort of a more regular 9-to-5 job, fell into technology and have been involved with technology consulting my entire career, focused on working with C-level stakeholders and solving business problems. And I've gone to many of the other various, big consulting firms and landed at Publicis Sapient a number of years ago, focused on our energy division, which help a lot of the largest oil and gas and power utilities across the globe with all things, especially around supply and trading and value chain optimization. So optimizing the molecule as it's lifted from the ground, refined, moved, and ultimately to the last mile in the fuel retailer. The aviation is a very interesting mix. I have supported travel and hospitality in the past, and I've always been an av geek, Madison. I love flying. I never take it for granted. There's something really cool. I follow the industry trends. And there's a great crossover in what we do at Publicis Sapient, helping our airline customers in multitudes of different ways. But in the last couple of years, we have introduced to airlines, and we've helped them before around their trading strategies. But this whole value chain optimization, as we call it, right? Airlines, when they procure fuel to the wingtip, there is a lot of opportunity there for them to gain efficiencies and realize some savings by just adjusting and tweaking. So there's this great crossover and overlap that has allowed us to dive into airlines on that side of the fence and not just, your customer experience, your loyalty, your IROPS, those sorts of things. So it's a new venture relatively in the last few years, but we've seen a lot of great success, especially Madison, with what's been going on here recently in the Middle East?
Right, yeah, exactly. And coming to the US-Iran peace process and everything that's been happening, I know that it's a very fast-changing situation. Even when I was, planning this podcast myself, the situation has changed since. It was going to be all about the Strait of Hormuz reopening finally, but things are very complex. So just to summarize, a memorandum of understanding to end the war was signed by the US and Iran on the 17th of June, and the Strait of Hormuz was cautiously reopened. However, on Friday last week, Iran accused Israel and US of violating the ceasefire due to strikes in Lebanon, and the further peace talks in Switzerland were cancelled. They were reinstated over the weekend, and now there's been a fair amount of clashing over the terms of the agreement. So that's where we are now for our listeners. What would you say, Chris, has been the impact of this current volatility and uncertainty on the oil markets and the aviation sector in general?
Oh, you've asked a very broad and open-ended question, and we can go in a number of different ways, but I'll say this: I think the only certainty that we have now moving forward is uncertainty in
Okay.
how the strait will be policed and opened and closed moving forward. Right? The fact of the matter is this: 20% of our global oil supply, gas supply is adversely affected at any one moment because of this Strait of Hormuz closure. The other facts of the matter are that refineries and trains, like in the Middle East, have been damaged, destroyed, and there is a long runway glide path to get back to 100%. I mean,
Right.
we've heard, high-ranking members of the UAE saying, "Look, we expect to be back in the next 12 months, maybe 50 to 60% capacity and 80% capacity within 2 years," which sounds great, but that's still 20% missing.
Right.
And the other fact of the matter is that even Shell leadership has been quoted on news outlets saying that there is inventory missing, right, on the scale of hundreds of millions of barrels of oil that is just gone from the supply chain, right?
Okay.
And I will kind of just my if I had a crystal ball, right, to look out, we see that the prices of crude right now are down to more reasonable levels in the low $70 a barrel. But the market really hasn't accounted for those the missing inventory yet, because through this whole crisis, the U.S. reserve supply has been used up to support the global economy. China has been pulling from their own strategic reserve. So nobody has been going out to the market saying, "I need 5 million barrels of oil and I need it today and I'm willing to pay top dollar." It hasn't happened yet.
Right.
And so because of that, to kind of stitch that all together here, aviation fuel prices have come down, from almost $5 a gallon to somewhere a little bit under 3, right? Almost the kind of where it was pre-war. But it would not surprise me when these inventory issues arise down the road that we may see some blips again. Right. So from a pure
Okay.
inventory supply chain perspective, that's something that I just want to make sure that the viewers and the listeners understand that just hasn't been accounted for yet.
Right. Absolutely. And I know that you were quoted in Forbes as saying that markets are still expecting elevated prices, continued volatility, and they are unlikely to experience meaningful cost relief in the near term. So, in terms of the timeline of recovery, how would you expect the timeline to be? Is it, months, years? When do you expect that we will get back to normality?
So that question of when do we get back to normal is a two-pronged answer, because one has to do with jet fuel supply and like when does supply kind of normalize? And then you're also asking the question, well, when does it normalize so that customers can maybe realize potentially lower airfare prices because fuel is not expensive? So there's two answers. So from a pure inventory supply level, we're probably looking, if nothing else changes today, right? Because the only certainty is uncertainty. You're still probably looking at anywhere from 6, 8 to 12 months for the crude
Right.
production to stabilize. And remember, jet fuel is not the raw crude fuel. You have to talk about, refineries have to come back online. Refineries right now that pivoted hard to make up for the disparity and cranked up jet fuel at the expense of maybe other distillates and other byproducts, they may start changing those amounts in their own refineries. And so it might slow the amount of refined product, aka jet fuel, that ends up going. Like it's a game. But 6 to 12 months for the crude. Refined into jet fuel, probably a little bit longer out. And that's from, again, an inventory. Here's the kicker, Madison, right? And this was just quoted by Scott Kirby to Reuters here not all that long ago, that people were expecting the U.S. legacy carriers, your Uniteds, your Americans, your Deltas, to struggle to recoup their costs in the next year, 100% due to the inflated fuel prices. But Scott Kirby said we expect to recoup 100%, okay, this year. Not 50,
Right.
not 60, 100. So what does that tell you? That tells you, which tells me, that airlines are going to keep their prices high to recoup their costs. So even though the fuel cost as a percentage of the ticket may go down, they're still going to keep it up, and they're going to expect their passengers to absorb that cost. And so far, we are. That is what the market is
Right.
bearing. So between increased baggage fees and between these higher prices, I actually do not expect these prices to necessarily go down
Yeah,
right away anytime soon.
absolutely. Yeah, in researching for this podcast, I read a lot of sources that said the same thing. You know, airlines are going to kind of profiteer, and they won't necessarily lower the airfares because passengers have proof that they are willing to pay the higher price. Do you think an element of that passenger behavior might just be because of kind of the headlines on the situation have said, you have to expect the prices will be high right now. As the situation kind of recovers, do you think that passengers will continue to be willing to pay these elevated prices?
I am of the mindset
Mm.
that, and I'm speaking for, the legacy carriers, right? The vast majority of passengers understand that this is sort of the new normal.
Right.
I can't speak for, those that, expect to travel on your ULCCs, both in North America and Europe and globally. It's a little bit of a different story. And it's a little bit of a different predicament. But I think this becomes the new normal. This becomes the
Right.
new normal for passengers to bear. And we look, air demand has just been going up and up and up post COVID, right? I think
Yeah.
there's this new mentality of wanting to enjoy and appreciate experiences still, right? They may not have as deep of the pockets post COVID as they did maybe in 22, 23, but there is still that kind of new wave of how airline passengers want to enjoy themselves. And so this does become the new normal. Now, this becomes a challenge for your ULCCs. And how do we keep fares low for those that, aren't willing to bear that larger prices for your Lufthansas, for your Uniteds, for your, JALs? But
Mm.
I think this just becomes a new learned way of the world for passengers.
Okay, I see. Um, and coming to, the process of importing oil and jet fuel, I know Europe in particular is heavily dependent on imports. And this might make it, particularly vulnerable to geopolitical shocks, fuel shocks like this. What do you think needs to be done to kind of make the region and aviation in general more kind of resilient to these shocks? I know there's been rising SAF production. Some people in the industry have said, we need to start looking at green and alternative fuels. To what extent do you think that this can help the industry reduce its reliance on shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, or has it not really made an impact?
Well, there was an interesting period of time where, the European Energy Association president made this big claim a couple months ago that Europe only had 6 weeks left of supply. And then the
Mm.
IATA president at their general meeting said there's absolutely no fuel shortage whatsoever in Europe, and there never has been. The reality of the situation is, yeah, there was initially a blip for sure for Europe receiving, because Europe does not have refineries. As a whole,
Yeah.
Europe does not possess the refinery capabilities to be able to take crude and turn it into something like aviation fuel. But they were able to be taken care of by US and African refineries that pivoted to increasing jet fuel production. Because the refineries were smart. They knew that, and we could talk about crack spread. This is a very important topic in the world of aviation fuel. But the crack
Okay.
spread was very meaningful enough for these refineries to change sort of the outputs of what they were producing. And the U.S. and Africa were able to stabilize, right, the production or the deliveries of fuel that was needed for places like Europe and certain places within Asia. Now
Okay.
you brought up SAF, and what's interesting is that SAF is not really looked at and thought of as a replacement for traditional aviation fuel. It's
All
not
right.
it's never been meant as security. It's always been looked at as here's a more green way, right? Reduction of carbon in the atmosphere, reduction of carbon dioxide. So to rely on SAF and to produce it at levels which right now no airline is able to produce it at levels that makes it a true viable alternative. That won't be the plan. And here's the other interesting kicker, and I'll say
Mhm.
this. So people expected, oh, these oil prices are going up. Sustainable aviation fuel, the raw ingredients, the feedstocks that are needed, right, has nothing to do with oil. We're talking like algae and like oil, consumed oil and beef tallow and there's nothing to do with oil. So like the prices should not be affected by it. Well,
Right.
SAF prices actually were also increasing during this the
Okay.
whole conflict in Iran because they were smart. They realized if oil prices are going up, like why should not our prices like ours should also go up? So
Right.
the raw
Interesting.
materials in SAF were also increasing, not to the levels that we were seeing of a $100 equivalent barrel of oil, but they weren't staying low like maybe people were thinking about or predicting from a security perspective, right, or an alternative perspective. So that also, was not a lever that airlines could pull. But like, we're just going to, move more to SAF. It didn't make sense financially either.
Yeah. Okay. I see. Um, and I know that air cargo routes have also been impacted by this war. Um, not just in terms of fuel prices, but because supply chains have, shifted away from the Middle East. Um, So, how do you think that this has impacted the resilience of supply chains? And do you think that more companies will be switching to, maritime freight going forward?
Well, look, long story short, the IATA during their general meeting here earlier this month said that air cargo is actually going to slightly increase even this year, even with everything that has just transpired to
Mm,
like $162 billion. Now, volumes will remain relatively flat. So, in essence, they're going to increase money by charging more for the shipping of the air freight, but they're not
right,
expecting to see a precipitous decline. Now, for certain suppliers and manufacturers that produce a lot of a product, if there's no need for speed, then sure, we can foresee, increases in maritime shipments because, slower, you don't pay as much per item. But at the same time, I go back to, diesel prices also went up because again, when we talk about refineries, when they make the refined product, we typically think about there's a saying in energy 3-2-1 crack spread, right? For every three
right,
barrels of oil produces 2 barrels of gasoline and 1 barrel of distillate, which is something like a barrel of jet fuel or a barrel of diesel. So you're still competing between diesel and aviation fuel and how refiners are producing. So it's still an increase in cost. So it's kind of six in one hand, a half dozen in the other. But we're not seeing as of right now and what the markets are talking about that air cargo is significantly going to decline here because of this.
okay, all right, that's good news. Um, so, just to finish off, really, I wanted to ask about your thoughts on what the future of aviation holds, in this new normal. as you described it, marked by geopolitical shocks, not just in terms of wars and global conflict, but also there's political volatility, there's economic pressures that show no signs of going away. Um, so, in your view, what do you think that the aviation industry has to do to become more resilient in this, new normal?
Well, I think a couple of things are going to happen,
Mm.
Madison. Number one, we are going to see more airlines go under.
All
We're going to
right.
see consolidation in this industry, and it may not be acquisitions. If you look at here in the United States, Delta, United, American, they're definitely looking forward to. I'm not saying that they're actively, being malicious about it, but they're not going to shed a tear if other ULCCs go under, because then they can pick up those routes, right, that are not serviced anymore. That gives them more capacity. It gives them more an opportunity, and frankly, they don't have to compete as much, right, on prices. Right? So prices will go
Right.
up. We are seeing it right now with Spirit Airlines. Prices have gone up, airfares have gone up even since Spirit dissolved. And we're seeing this more in Europe because there's a larger proliferation of ULCCs. We're probably going to see more if they don't go under, certainly tremendous cuts in their network. I mean, we've seen it already with Lufthansa CityLine, Eurowings, and others in Europe, and that will continue, right? So there is going to be a consolidation in some way, shape, or form. That is going to happen. It's just kind of the nature of the beast when a large geopolitical event like this happens.
Mm.
What I would also say is that not every airline, certainly no airline in the US, nobody hedges fuel in the United States anymore. We know that this still happens in Europe and in Asia with large
Right.
players. But we are going to start to see more of a focus on how can we become more efficient in that chain. I mentioned earlier about like the work that Sapient does with energy companies around value chain optimization and what we're starting to expand into with airlines, right? When airlines procure fuel, right, and they have it, whether it's third party terminals, on airport storage, off airport, how does it get transported the last mile all the way to the wingtip? There are always inefficiencies that happen there and that aren't necessarily looked at as much with a fine-tooth comb, that things like artificial intelligence can now be injected into, and data can
Right.
then be exposed to create little savings. And what we are seeing in the market and what we are able to deliver to airlines is saying, look, there are ways to save 1, 3, 5 cents a gallon of jet fuel. And if you multiply that by the hundreds, if not billions of gallons, right, these legacy carriers, these larger ones, consume, that adds up, right? So you're going to start to see airlines now start to maybe take a little bit more of a harder look at that chain, because in the past they go, yeah, it's a necessary expense, but it stayed steady at around $2.50, 60, 70 cents for a very long time. So I think this was sort of the awakening that airlines are like, hey, maybe we need to spend a little bit more of a fine tooth comb. Where can we find those efficiency gains? And this is something that Publicis Sapient has experience in delivering, is delivering, and we hope to continue delivering for our airline partners out there.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. It's good to know that, this new technology with AI is coming along and, airlines can make some sort of savings with that in the midst of all this volatility. Um, but Chris, it's been wonderful having you on. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And to our listeners, if there's any other guests you want me to bring on, any other topics you want me to discuss, please do reach out. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you, Madison. It's a pleasure.